Hello, mentors. So these questions come after students have made the translations and already found these percentage growth or scaling factors mentally. And so we're assuming that this data is already filled, such as here. Also these two cases, right? And you could think of as the whole table having these basic common words and translations, and also two per pair of students or so. So they may have more data points than these ones. So maybe if you have a lot of students, you could even have maybe 15, 16 pairs or so. So what we want to ask is first very open questions about which patterns about lengths of words did you see? So what do they say? Any conclusions or rule or hypothesis? So mainly, okay, you did this, but for what? What's the point of doing this? And you're not going to tell them, but you're going to ask them and guide them through. So that's the first part. Then more guided will predict if a list of words in English, any text or so has 100 letters, what would be the equivalent after translating? So what's the length after translating to Spanish? In reverse, if you start with 100 letters in Spanish, and then you translate these words, right, these phrases or text. So it could be a list of words, but it could also be a paragraph, just a very large, right, text about how many letters it has after you go to English. And then even more guided, you introduce scaling factor or multiplier. So of course you talk here a little bit about it, right? Because when you were doing conversions, fractions and decimals will appear when you make sense of these percentages. So they already know it. Maybe you said the word, but now it's official. Now it's scaling factor or multiplier. What's a representative scaling factor that would allow you to convert from English to Spanish? So think of it as a machine. And in reverse, what would be again? So let's take a look quickly at some possible solutions so that you can guide your students in this regard. So for the first part, of course, it's open, so you can anticipate even more than these ones. But for now, you could say that you could see that the scaling factors or growths are all different in general. It's not unique, right? This rule that takes me from some length to another length. So it's not uniform. It changes a lot. They could also observe, but sometimes the scaling factor is 1. In some cases, you don't change the length. This would be the first important step. The scaling factors from English to Spanish are more often than not larger than 1. So words in Spanish really tend to get longer. The reverse scaling, it's 1 over the other scaling factor. That could be another conclusion. And this is always true, so it doesn't matter which data they have. So this is a generality. You could ask them to think why, right? And then they could look at frequencies of the scaling factors or growth and see if it seems to be a higher concentration in a range, for example, 1, 2, or 1, 1.4. And they could even find an average scaling factor just by eyeballing, just intuition, like I think it's this estimation, or really find it, or they could also find the median. So what we mean by that is that when they did this part here, they can order these scaling factors and they could plot them in a number line even, or in this dot graph. And they could see that it concentrates kind of over here. So it's definitely more than 1. This is kind of a special case, kind of an outlier. This, I guess it was strawberry fresa that really got short, but it's not really something that happens too frequent. And so it's kind of be maybe 1.1 or maybe 1.2 or 1.3 or so. So that's a discussion that could really happen there. Okay, so for the second part, the predictions, they can, they can go in different ways, in increasing levels of sophistication and richness in how they approach this. And that's beautiful. I mean, that's great. You don't have to think that your students should always start with the perfect answer or the most rich. You just have to advance their thinking, no matter where they start. So students may start saying that it's just a number larger than 100. Okay, that's good, but it's impossible to know. Fair enough, we don't have the text, but I guess it's predicting, so we can do better. Okay, they could guess just using intuition, 200, 150, 110, just because, not much justification. At that point, you have to tell them to look at the data. Now, they could use a scaling factor that they really like from the data that they think is kind of representative. So they could go back and maybe take this one or whichever and just use that. Okay, that's okay. You're now looking at the data, but you're just looking at one in isolation. So it doesn't, I wouldn't be too convinced. So the next step is start thinking about an ideal, an average, or a representative scaling factor using the data collected, which we just discussed. So it could be something along the lines of maybe 1.2, this kind of an average, or even a median 1.3. So let's say they pick 1.2, and then they could answer just multiplying, right, 100 by 1.2. So the answer would be, it's fair to expect that the text in Spanish, or the list of words, it's of length 120. I would believe that. Of course, it may not be true, but if you take many, many texts, it's going to happen that most of them are getting close to 120. So that's some reasonable answer. For B, so let's take a look at B. It's going in backward mode, so they could redo what we just said about the strategies. Or what you really expect is that they are consistent with A. And if they pick the scaling of 1.2, namely 20% growth, then they pick a scaling back, right? A reverse scaling that is consistent, right? So namely the inverse of 1.2, which is not the same as 20% less, right? If you increase, let's take a look at an example. If you start with a number such as 100 and you increase it by 20%, you get 120. But then if you want to decrease 20%, you're not going to get 100 again. If you decrease 20%, you would do a minus 24. So you would get 96. So they have to think about what's the scaling factor to go back to 100, right? Which would be scaling back. And you can think about it as 6 parts here of 20, and you're losing one of them. So it's really 1/6, the new scaling factor. But anyways, that's for another time. We're looking at more the big picture. But you really want consistency here. You want to test this. For example, you would do it in reverse. So let's say they say that here goes from 100 over to 120, and say that here they predict that goes from 1,000 to 800 incorrectly, right? Thinking that it's also 20% less. Then you would ask, okay, if you go back to English, right? Oh, sorry, to Spanish, because you're now in English. You probably need to be consistent here and apply a 20% increase. And so what's 20% of 800? Well, 10% is 80. So 20% is 160. So I need to add 160. And I'm not going to get to 1,000 again, right? So there's something fishy here. And after some discussion in which they would think that it's actually 5/6, right, of 1,000, let's not compute it. If you go back here and do the translation, which is multiplying by 1.2, then you can see, well, 1.2 is really 12 over 10 or 6 over 5. And then you get just by canceling, right, the factors, you get back to 1,000. And then you're noting some structure, right? You're noting some fact that the scaling factors have to be opposite fractions or opposite numbers in the sense of multiplication, inverse. And so there's a lot of richness in A and B. C and D are making sure that you abstract the scaling factor, because you could answer this question in many ways, as we saw. One ideal way is with scaling factor. So if you already did that, then C is just confirming this, and it's just putting what you did. It's 1.2, and D would be the opposite. So it's kind of twins. They're kind of twins. In other words, doing C or D will depend on whether you did A or B at that general level of richness in which you introduce scaling factor. If you did not, then you have to do it here. And if you already did it, then this will be quicker. And that's totally okay. We're just centering ourselves in how the student is proceeding and opening up to many possibilities. And that's what we didn't put this in the backward order, but we rather did it in this way, in which we make it more open without asking yet for scaling factor. It's just a question. What about 100 letters? What happens when you go to Spanish? Which tools can you use? So more exploratory. Okay, so see you in another video. Take care.